Yeah. That's my bad.
It's all right. So, Jonathan, are you with us tonight?
I am.
Excellent. How are you today, sir?
Very good.
Okay. Glad to have you on the show.
Glad to be on.
So, you have an impressive resume here. First thing I have to ask is, how was it teaching the kids?
How was it teaching kids?
Yes.
Well, it was, I love working with kids, but I wouldn't be part of public education again. I mean, the overarching problem for me is whenever you're teaching somebody something against their will, you're not a teacher, you're a prison guard. So the only form of education I would ever be involved in again, and I sort of am, but on a very informal basis, is based on mutual enthusiasm. Otherwise, you're just part of some toxic patriarchal control system. You know, there are schools set up based on that exact principle called Sudbury schools. Summerhill in England was the first of these, where kids just learn based on their own enthusiasm. And basically, what I learned about compulsory education, boiled down to a single sentence, is that its real unconscious purpose was to be so sadistic and unpleasant so as to bring down your natural desire to learn sufficiently so society could make use of you. And so I don't want to be part of that kind of a thing. It's not that there aren't good people in those systems doing good things, but the whole idea of teaching people things against their will is a deal breaker for me.
Well said. Well said. So you're a gemologist. That's awesome. Can't say I've ever met someone. My uncle is hugely into gems. He loves that stuff. I mean, collects them and loves to display them all over. Really cool stuff. I mean, what got you into that?
Well, I guess I always had some fascination for crystals and precious stones, and kind of caught my eye when I graduated from college and wanted to find out more about the scientific end of it. So I became a gemologist, but I also worked in the commercial end of it as well. But my gemology skills are pretty rusty at this point.
Okay. Do you believe that these gems and crystals hold some, perhaps an energy or vibration, as some people believe?
Yeah, I mean, but I'm also kind of a pantheist in general. I mean, I think everything holds a vibration or an energy, and basically that's what physics tells us. I mean, there are no solid objects. Everything is a vibration. And there's also a branch of parapsychology called psychometry. It's about picking up vibrations from objects, which sounds very new agey or weird to some people. But I mean, if you think about a little thought experiment, you know, hold in one hand, you take like a Bic pen out of a cellophane bag of 20 identical spit out of a machine Bic pens, and hold that in one hand. The other hand, hold a gold locket that like a Civil War widow wore on her heart, for 50 years, that had contained the picture of her beloved who died in the Civil War. And I think that anybody with an ounce of sensitivity would feel that like one object had more history and more resonance and more something than the other. And so I think we're picking these things up all the time, but because right now the reigning creed in our culture is hardcore materialism, and a sort of naive materialism, because obviously, what are our cell phones doing but picking up vibrations? I mean, we live in a vibratory universe, so the idea that objects don't have memories is actually contradicted even by physics, where their objects do hold memories of energies that have come at them and so forth. So it doesn't seem like a very controversial thing to me to think that these objects like crystals that have been formed sometimes over millions of years, that's a long history, and they're highly organized, and so they are informational. That's what a crystal is. It's geometric information that's been created out of matter. So
awesome. Okay. So I see here that you are a fan of the Nibiru research. I like that. It's one of my
what
favorite
kind of
topics.
research?
Nibiru, Planet X.
No, I'm not.
That's not you. Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know.
No, not me. No.
Oh, I'm looking at another week. I'm sorry. Okay, that's not you. All
that's
right.
Good job. Good
that
job,
would have been awesome. That would have been awesome.
Yeah.
Shoot.
All right. What did I miss? Anything? Anything good? I'm back. Just missed Jeff screwing up the whole show, right, Mark?
I just presented a complete theory of everything, but I guess couldn't repeat that now.
Yeah, that was pretty cool, actually. Talk about everything has energy and which is, of course, just how it is. Everything vibrates, and I guess a lot of people believe that these crystals hold actual healing power, that they're alive, and that would be the controversy there. And I suppose it could be the case. I mean, there was the
there are people that will take an underlying reality and come up with flaky things about it, but that doesn't mean that there isn't an underlying truth to it. I mean, I think I don't think it's it shouldn't be a controversial idea to consider that the whole universe is alive. It certainly seems like an organism. I mean, James Lovelock, the British biologist who won the Nobel Prize for his Gaia hypothesis, that you should understand the whole planet as a single organism, that was accepted into mainstream science with their highest accolade, the Nobel Prize. The idea that the whole universe is an organism that supposedly emerged out of the Big Bang and so forth, why would we think that anything is not alive? It's all in a state of change. And, that's why I don't use the word nature, because it's a meaningless word. There's nothing that's outside of nature. Everything is natural. The word has no meaning, really.
Oh, I would agree with most. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just, I mean, what is the Empire State Building? I mean, why isn't that as natural as a beehive? It's just another structure made by Earth organisms. Everything is natural.
So I'm looking at the title of the show, and I don't see anything in your bio mentioning mind parasites or energy vampires. Where does that come into play?
Well, it began with personal experiences and a lot of research. Obviously, it's a speculative field, but I think it can be put on a pretty rational basis. And one way of understanding this subject is to realize that it's totally possible for people to miss a whole dimension of life. And it's funny because we were just talking about that the universe is alive and that there's, everywhere there are dimensions of life. So, for example, every culture missed the whole microbiological plane of reality. It wasn't until a Dutch janitor, basically A.V. Leeuwenhoek, in the 1600s, ground the first lenses that were precise enough to make a primitive microscope and to see a protozoa, a giant of the microbiological world. And suddenly, we began to wake up to the reality that not only was there this whole fantastic cryptozoology of microbiological organisms, but that actually they were us, that our bodies are a colony, basically, of a network of 60 trillion of these creatures. I mean, if you tried to explain that to somebody in the 1500s, you had been burned at the stake. And so, and yet that is the reality. I mean, surgeons in the past were washing their hands after surgery, but not before. But now we just grow up taking this for granted because now we have electron microscopes, and we are constantly probing into that world. And also, once we discovered that dimension of life that we were ignorant of, we discovered the same classic relationships of energetic transaction that we find in the macrobiological world, such as symbiosis, my favorite, predation, and parasitism. And parasitism is one of the most common of all relationships between living things. Like according to National Geographic, in the regular macrobiological world, parasites outnumber all other species 4 or 5 to 1. Almost every organism has parasites, And most parasites even have parasites. Like, what is malaria? It's a microbiological parasite that lives in mosquitoes. And so we live in a parasite-riddled world. And in fact, parasites are so related to the core of evolution that some British biologists came up with something called the Red Queen hypothesis. It comes from something in Alice in Wonderland where the Red Queen tells Alice, well, you see, here, my dear, you have to run as fast as you can just to stay in one place. And so their idea is that because parasites are such a potent factor and outnumber other species, that in order for hosts to stay even half a step ahead, they had to develop sexual reproduction, which creates greater genetic novelty. So they believe that sex was an adaptation to parasites. So all I'm proposing is that there is another dimension of life besides the microbiological and the macrobiological of energetic organisms. And in fact, this is not anything very new. Every single culture on Earth has recognized this dimension of life except for one, naive fundamentalist materialism. You go to any culture, Christianity will talk about energetic parasites, the incubi and the succubi. In Buddhism, they call them the pretas, or the hungry ghosts. In the traditional medicine of China and the traditional medicine of India, Ayurveda, the study of energetic parasites and their effect on human health is as mainstream a medical subspecialty as gynecology. So, for example, of like the 500-something acupuncture points on the body, something like 38 of them have the prefix Quay in front of them. And Quay just means disincarnate entity. And the idea is that these are 38 energy meridians where energetic parasites can feed. And so I don't think it's as exotic or esoteric a subject as some people might make it out to be. However, I also don't claim to be able to put such a fine point on it that we can, list every species and pretend to know too much about it, which is a flaw in a lot of esoteric research. Like the kind of people who study ufology and can tell you the names of everybody on the Palladian High Council. I'm not afraid to say there are areas that are very fuzzy and that we don't know exactly. I mean, we're still desperately trying to learn things about the microbiological realm because it's often a devastating threat to human life, and we haven't unlocked all of its secrets. Because science ignores this other dimension of life that every other culture has recognized and seen the effects of. We don't have people really systematically studying it and creating instruments that will detect it. So we're forced to kind of muddle around in a field in which there's a lot of lore and there's a lot of anecdotal reports, but there's not a whole lot of systematic knowledge about it.
And Jonathan, real quick, why do you think that is? Like, why do you think our culture has such a hard time with it? Tackling that.
Well, it's because it has a hard time with the paranormal in general. And a good friend of mine, George Hansen, wrote an amazing book that everyone should read called The Trickster and the Paranormal. And he's some kind of a social scientist. And basically, the case that he makes in this book is that because the paranormal is very related to the trickster archetype, it's very shape-shifting, it's very hard to grasp hold of, it doesn't repeat itself on demand, it violates expected norms and social structures, that basically the more complex a society is or a social order is, the more hostile it is to the paranormal. So the least complex society would be a hunter-gatherer tribe, and they'll have a shaman. They'll be completely friendly to the paranormal. But once you have a very complex society that's very hierarchical, say like the Catholic Church or the U.S. government or the institutions of science, it's extremely hostile to this thing that respects no boundaries and that violates all norms. So, for example, there was a Catholic catechism that was written in the 1990s that said study of the paranormal or the occult is fundamentally anti-religious. I mean, that's incredible nonsense. I mean, this is a religion based on burning bushes and people parting the Red Sea and so forth. It's just we keep our paranormal comfortably in the past. We don't want it. Like I remember at Sunday school being told the age of miracles is over, and I immediately felt that was a lie. But they want the old paranormal from the biblical days is accepted, but God forbid you hear a burning bush speaking to you, and they'll be pumping you full of psychiatric meds in no time. And because these things threaten social structures, they threaten the patriarchy.
I would agree with you 100%. Do you believe in the Bible in a biblical sense?
No, absolutely not. I mean, not in a literal sense. I'm not a fundamentalist, but let's remember there are people who believe in the Bible in a more sophisticated sense. But I'm not. I just see it as an historic document written by many human authors, some of whom may have been divinely inspired, and others of whom were murderous creeps, and put in all kinds of horrible stuff.
Right.
So it's just a very mixed bag. There's some.
I'm a Christian, but I believe most Christians have it wrong, and I question the Bible. I'll be the first to admit it. I question it a lot, so I was just curious.
Well, if you did.
But I definitely believe in. Where I was going with that was the way I word it more of like the spiritual realm of good and evil.
Well, I think there's an inner spirit in certain religions that may be a lot better than some of the scar tissue and the cultural artifacts that some people assume is a religion. I mean, Jung was a Gnostic Christian, and a lot of the best things in the Bible were edited out by the Roman Emperor Constantine at the Council of Nicaea.
Yeah,
and especially when they repressed the Gnostics.
Or something like that.
Yeah, there was all kinds of things. I mean, there was a vote of hands, about whether we believed in reincarnation or not, and so forth. And just one Gnostic gospel, I mean, the Gospel of John, Jesus says at one point, if you drink from my mouth, I become you and you become me. That if that one statement were put back in and really understood, it would have prevented a tremendous amount of violence and suffering. Because once, as the Gnostics realized, once you project the Godhead out onto an external savior, you start to create a huge schizoid split in the psyche. And Jung wrote a book about this called Aeon. So there was a lot of, I think religions may have like an inner spirit, some of them, and they may also have a lot of dark things that have accreted themselves around that spirit and cause a lot of damage. So religions are moving targets. There are inspired parts, and then there are very toxic parts as well.
Oh, certainly. Yeah.
So,
and actually, the Gnostics understood mind parasites. They said that they believed that there was a meta species they called the archons that they believed were manipulating us. And what they said, and this is stuff that they said 2,000 years ago, around the time the New Testament was written, is they said that the archons would keep us in order to harvest our negative emotions as an energetic feast, basically. They would keep us at war with each other through religious ideologies.
Yes, the archons. I've heard of this before. See, when you say mind parasites, I keep thinking in my head actual brain parasites that are like lurking around in the brain.
Right. Well, to materialists, the mind, which many of them don't even believe exists, is reducible to brain function. Mm-hmm. So that's how you can tell you're in the presence of a materialist, is that they believe in neurological materialism. They believe that consciousness is just an epiphenomenon or a secondary effect of biochemical process in the brain. Mm-hmm. But there's all kinds of scientific and empirical evidence to demonstrate that that's not the case. like findings from near-death experience research. And so they're the ones that have encouraged us to think that we're nothing more than our brains and bodies. And that is a devastating lie that causes all kinds of damage to how people view themselves, time, body, sex, nation state, everything.
Right.
Once you believe that, you're really trapped in a dark matrix.
Oh, absolutely. So, you are also talking about physical parasites, though, correct? I mean...
Well, I mean, I was talking earlier about physical parasites, which is an amazing subject in itself. I mean, some of the incredible. I mean, you know, on the regular straight science level, I mean, there are microbiological parasites that have an ability to completely manipulate very complex animals, you know, like mammals, and get them to do their bidding. I mean, you know, that's what rabies does. It will take a mammal, drive it into a bloodthirsty frenzy, so it will bite other mammals, opening a vector for the disease to spread. And there are other parasites that do incredible manipulations of various hosts to get them to do their bidding so that they can fulfill their life cycle. So there's a lot of, basically, you know, like in the alchemical model, as above, so below. So below is the microbiological world, and in the microbiological world we see a lot of parasitism going on, and we see it in the macrobiological world, and I would expect that we would find it above in energetic organisms, and that's what every culture reports. And I began noticing a lot of this just from doing 35 years of dream interpretation for people, and people would bring in these reports of these nighttime spectral attacks that I noticed were highly stereotyped and seemed to be completely devoid of psychological content. You know, they didn't seem like nightmares about you wake up and, you know, your mother looks like Freddy Krueger and she's having sex with you or something. I mean, these would be these terrifying attacks, but there'd be no personal psychological content whatsoever. And basically, when a society is in trouble when it denies a whole sphere of human testimony, like we did that for centuries about child abuse. And now fundamentalist materialism dismisses all such reports and says it's just sleep paralysis and you know, or hallucinations or whatever. But there's a hell of a lot of human testimony from many different cultures reporting this stuff. And that doesn't mean you have to take what every one of those reports says literally, but if there's that much human experience and human phenomenon going on, you need to look into it. But in a lot of fundamentalist science, what we call scientism, there's a tendency to explain away the uninvestigated rather than to investigate the unexplained, which is what science's job is supposed to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
So do you think that materialism is the parasite that just finds different hosts and plagues the world?
Well, I think that there's no one thing that is the parasite. There are many, many different things. It's like when we discovered the microbiological world, we discovered this fantastic cryptozoology. So as I talk about in some of my writings about mind parasites can take on many, many different forms and many different types. It could be a cultural meme. It could take the form of, you know, a single sentence that somebody says to somebody that puts a dark thought in their mind, and then they proceed to act on that thought. It can take the form of a toxic religious ideology, but it could also be an actual outside entity that attacks a vulnerable psyche.
Jonathan, are you familiar with the Toltec tribe and the Toltec teachings?
Not that familiar. You might want to invite my friend John Major Jenkins, who writes about Mesoamerican and especially Mayan stuff.
Yeah.
He would know. He would be much more informed about that.
What's his name? Just maybe for future
John
reference.
Major Jenkins. He's a guy who came up with the idea of the that the Maya were predicting a galactic alignment, an optical galactic alignment in 2012. And though he was one of the few voices of reason about that whole fiasco, I've written about it called Carnival 2012. But he's written several books about the Maya. One of them has an introduction by Terence McKenna. I actually met John through Terence. Maya Cosmogenesis 2012, Galactic Alignment are two of his better-known books. The 2012 Story is another one. But he'd be a good one to have on to talk about anything Mesoamerican, like the Toltecs, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I wrote the name down. I'll get with Chris later about talking about getting him on. Yeah, the only reason I ask is because what you were talking about is kind of goes hand in hand with it a little bit. So
you'll find that almost every ancient culture, almost every culture except fundamentalist materialism, recognized that there were life forms that
right.
some of which were benevolent and some of whom were predators and some of whom were parasites.
Right.
So everybody has parasites. How do we get rid of them? Do we go vegan for a few months?
Well, there are many answers to that question, and it depends on what type of parasites we're talking about. And one thing that way in which parasites or mind parasites can really take people over is what Jung called shadow projection. And this might be controversial, but I mean, I was even hearing some possible shadow projection going on in the earlier part of the show. It's a very common thing among people in the counterculture, just as it is amongst religious fundamentalists and many other people. Shadow projection is when you project the dark force onto a particular group. Then you're kind of infected by a mind parasite and are likely to commit violence or to have very strange projections. So different groups will, so if you're, say, a fundamental evangelical Christian, then maybe you project the dark force onto Islam, Russia, China, terrorists, what have you. But if you're in the certain countercultural groups, then you project the shadow onto the U.S. government, Israel, and globalizing corporations, but will not recognize that, say, ISIS or that fundamentalist Muslims are often rabidly possessed by a dark force that's not merely a reaction to something that one of the groups that they believe can contain the dark force, like the U.S. government, but that evil can have an independent origination in any one of us. So whenever you have thinking that's based on the idea of, like, we know who the bad guys are, here are the guys wearing the black hats, and usually every group has black hats in it. So the U.S. government, Israel, globalizing corporations are an enormous hook for shadow projection. But then if that causes you to think that religious fundamentalists who've been doing global jihads before there was a U.S. and Israel or globalizing corporation. I mean, Muslim fanatics, and they're really not fanatics, they're often people who are following the tenets that you can read in the Quran, almost conquered Europe. They were stopped outside the gates of Vienna on September 11th of 1638. And there was no Israel, and there was no U.S., and there were no global corporations. But what happens is, if we find that certain groups carry the dark force, we become more and more paranoid about them. They loom larger and larger as boogeymen that and puppet masters that are said to be controlling everything. And now you're infected with a mind parasite, because now you don't realize that, hey, maybe you treat your girlfriend really bad, and you don't bother to think about that because you're too busy thinking about the New World Order. And so you very subtly let yourself off the hook and don't reclaim your own shadow. So when Jung was once giving a seminar in Weimar, Germany, and Nazi Germany, basically, and there were Nazis literally goose-stepping outside on the street, and people said, well, given the evil in the world, what can we do about it? And Jung said, begin by reclaiming your own shadow from the world. As soon as you see people who are obsessed with what the Jews are doing, or what the Muslims are doing, or what whatever group is doing, and I fall into this sometimes myself, then that allows them, their own shadow, their own evil, to run amok without them noticing, because they can outsource it all to the black hat group.
Mm.
And so that is a classic way in which, and what are the people in those groups doing but the very same thing?
Right.
And so now you have a perfect recipe to keep us constantly fighting each other and creating a great harvest of negative energy. And I don't know if you're familiar with the artist Alex Gray, but some of his paintings are incredible revelation or images of this. He had an experience on LSD in the late 60s or early 70s that led to his painting demons and deities drinking from the milky pool. He was basically just at a party and where everyone had taken acid, and he noticed like people were like hitting on each other in really ugly ways, and they were just like really being there was just some kind of dark force present, and he began to see the entities that were like hovering in space, sort of, or in hyperspace or something, that were just feeding off of all this energy of all these dark emotions. And I wrote an article that you can read on my website. It's also maybe on Reality Sandwich and Australian magazine New Dawn. Just reprinted it, called Alex Gray and the Mind Parasites. And it also quotes from some Gnostic texts, and some of the things in these Gnostic texts line up exactly with what Alex Gray experienced. So we conventionally assume that we're at the top of the food chain, and that's a very convenient delusion for those who may actually be at the top of the food chain.
How about that?
And one, I mean, I was hanging out in a free campground in 2003. It's a long story, but I started reading this book called Eyewitness to History, and it was basically like first-person accounts of people who were present at, and went through the Gulag Archipelago, or the Nazi death camps, but also things in the ancient world. And it started to become mind-boggling, like how over the top was human evil. It was very hard to explain from a practical point of view. Like, for example, the KGB under Stalin was like rounding up and killing and imprisoning millions of their own citizens who had done nothing. And one of the ways that the KGB liked to denounce somebody is they would go find that person, pretend to be their friend, and like buy them drinks and hang out with them at a bar for hours. And then suddenly, like late into the night, they would suddenly stand up and it'd be like, you're an enemy of the state, and drag them off. What was the purpose of that whole charade? It seemed to have no purpose but terror itself. Mm-hmm. So this is a very interesting word, terrorism. There seems to be something that takes over people. If you look at some of the amazingly grotesque things that serial killers do, but also that like groups like ISIS are doing. There was sometime after 9/11, they were talking to a member of Al-Qaeda or whatever, an imam, and he said, you Americans need to understand that just as much as your young men love life, our young men love death. So there's a real like death force, a death frenzy, and a frenzy to create suffering in other people that, almost like rabies, that takes us over, that serves no practical purpose. Like, what was the purpose for the Stalin regime to kill millions of its own citizens? It really just damaged their own economy.
Don't you feel that fear is the easiest way to control people?
Well, it often is, but what we see from the world of modern capitalism is, effective companies like Apple and Google, innovative companies, it's not efficient. Fear is a highly inefficient way to control people, because then they become mechanical, they become uncreative, they become financially less productive, and so and that's one of the reasons why the Soviet Union collapsed. And so fear is not a great motivating force. It's a great motivating force, but it's not a very efficient or healthy one. It ultimately is self-defeating.
No, I'm certainly not saying it's a healthy, way to get to not any way to control somebody is probably not healthy, but you know what I mean. It's not a healthy situation, but I just think that a lot of government and other, a lot of different people in organizations use fear.
So do conspiratists, right?
This is where
the thing is that
I'm going to assume. Sorry, this is where the archons come in, right? This is the whole fear-driven.
Yeah, but what we have to be careful about is that we will see the group that we project the shadow on as the fearmongers, while we ourselves may be doing fear-mongering in the process.
Mm-hmm.
So the people who are putting out, people I've met who put out a food of fear and put out fear vibes more reliably than almost any religious fundamentalist I've met are conspiratists. I'm not saying that there aren't conspiracies, but I'm saying that a lot of conspiratists are possessed with a fear point of view. And just like lots of other people, I mean, my dad had books on the shelf that were bestsellers called like The Crash of '79, and he was a conspiracy guy, but a better informed one than most. But a lot of, if you listen to like Alex Jones and remember things that he said in the past, there's not going to be a 2008 election because George Bush secretly passed the such and such, and they've got the Amero all ready to go, and the FEMA camps are ready to take you away. But the people who buy into that fear thing never notice that these things don't actually come to pass. And yet, meanwhile, people are living in this state of intense fear that the conspiratists are, where the boogeyman is always just about around the corner ready to take them off to the FEMA camps, except it never quite happens. And so where you see like a breakdown in reality testing and where fear is constantly being put forward, when you're living in a police state, it's not that subtle. You don't need Alex Jones to tell you. You will personally know 50 people who are taken away in the middle of the night. Now, that doesn't mean we live in a completely free society in which there are not police state tactics going on. We live in a gray world where there's plenty of darkness there. But where you see like what I think is like a mind parasite possession is people who greatly exaggerate these things and create tremendous states of fear, like in Alex Jones. And even the way he talks, it's always like the tone of voice of you're on the third floor and the first two floors are already on fire and you're about to get burned up. Yet life seems to be going pretty merrily. We right now, like for example, you would never guess from hearing many of these people talk or even listening to the news that right now we have the lowest per capita war death rate in human history.
Oh yeah, right. There's no doubt about that. Well, I mean, the world wars had hundreds of millions of people killed.
Well, World War I, it was 25 million. World War II is 65 million. But Steven Pinker, who's an anthropologist and a psychologist, and he gave an interesting TED Talk on this, he pointed out that even in the bloody 20th century, the per capita war death rate in the West was much lower than in a normal year if you were growing up as a young man in a rainforest tribe. Your likelihood of being killed in warfare, in intertribal warfare, was far higher. So a lot of things, I'm not saying that like the 20th century wasn't a nightmare, but a lot of dark things are sort of disproportionately warped in our minds, and to me, that's often evidence of mind parasite manipulation, where a particular group is singled out obsessively, and that group, no doubt, will have a shadow, but where its sins and its flaws and its darkness is so exaggerated, and then you have a total breakdown in reality testing. Like an example of this from the conspiratist worldview is that you will have people who will talk about an Illuminati and will basically claim that there's a single group of archons or whatever controlling everything. But any glance at the news and at actual world events, or just even being part of the marketplace, shows you that actually the most obvious thing about our world is that we live in a world of competing spheres of power. Google is competing with Apple. China is competing with us. There's no single group running all that stuff. If there were, then we would have to have like a transhuman species, like the Archons, that would be feeding off of, our negative energies. But there's no set of human egos running the entire show, because everywhere you see in U.S. politics, like there are other people who say, well, the Republicans and Democrats, they're all on the same, playing for the same team. And sometimes they are, definitely. But other times you see real competition between, like the 25 people running for the Republican presidential, nomination will be tearing each other's throats out. That's not just staged. That's just 25 people who all want the same thing and are competing with each other. But you have a breakdown in reality testing with a lot of conspiracy folk where they think that there's one set of puppet masters controlling everything, and that just denies the evidence of how the world works.
So
on a very basic level.
It's not only war. I mean, it's not only the 100 million people that died in war. It's more than 150 million people. You mentioned Russia. There's China. There's Cambodia, and of course everyone knows about Germany. What is it about these governments that makes them commit these sorts of evil, and what makes our government any sort of exception, considering that we help to fund some of these evils in the world?
Well, with the Nazis, that's where you really, and also I think with some of the Islamic jihadists, where you see people who really look possessed. You've got to remember that the whole Nazi thing was very sci-fi and very occult. To take like an astrological symbol and reverse the rays so it become like a symbol of darkness. Hitler had started out as an unemployed artist going to the occult bookstore. That was, and Jung wrote about this, you read volume 10 of his collected work, Civilization and Transition. He watched this total possession go on. This was like demonic possession. It wasn't just, in other cases you have governments do evil things for economic reasons because they want oil or things like that. There are people who idealize the U.S. government and are like the super patriot type that can find no flaw in us and try and idealize this country, and that's totally ridiculous and naive. But then there are also people who assume that all the world's evils are created by the U.S. government, and
it's definitely not the government.
Considerable ones are.
I would say it would be the central banks, if anything, and we're just a puppet. But Hitler wasn't just an exception; he wasn't an anomaly. Mao Zedong was also supposedly into all the occult and all that, and Hitler was put into power by people who were into all that, and the Thule Society. So, and there's a lot of speculation. Obviously it's speculation, whatever, that our government is into the occult, or some high power figures are. So why is it that?
Yeah, there were certainly.
Not much of a speculation.
Yeah, there were certainly members of our government who were sympathizers, but it's also, but we would be stepping into a total breakdown of reality testing if we didn't remember stuff like D-Day that my dad was part of, and the massive. Military effort we made to the firebombing of Dresden and all that kind of stuff. So you definitely see a real competition and real battle between forces, and it wasn't like, we would have had a very different outcome if we were really just on the side of the Nazis at that point. So what happens, though, is that political correctness and basically people coming from a conspiratist point of view may not recognize that their point of view is actually one of a certain political correctness within their subculture, and within and these are most of my friends, for example. I get into trouble with them all the time, and I might be stirring up a hornet's nest right now, but basically you're allowed to project any dark motive or claim any evil about the U.S. government or Israel, or globalizing corporations, or central banks. But you can't do that to an exotic culture like the Muslims. If they do anything bad, it's merely reactive to something we did first or something, forgetting that they were doing really bad things before there was a U.S. government or an Israel or a global corporation. And so this is where I see shadow projection going on. It's not that the U.S. government doesn't have a shadow. It's got a huge one. It's not that Israel and global corporations don't. It's that when you have people who are like, they're the ones, everything dark is about them. You know, I've had people go on and on about that at a bar, and I'm looking at this guy and I'm like, yeah, but you know, you just cheated on your girlfriend. Like, you know, you know, what do you do to make the world a better place? It's like Goethe said, you know, you want to clean up the world, begin with your own doorstep. So what you have is people who are not looking at their own darkness and not looking at their own shadow projection, but are busy finding all these incredible dark puppet masters manipulating everything, and meanwhile they're stirring up a huge feast of negative emotions and fear. And also, a lot of the stuff they predict doesn't happen. You know, they'll tell you it's all lies, and you can read. You know, I've got a YouTube called "Problems with the Conspiratist Worldview." If you want to look into this more, I've written about this extensively. You know, they're so busy, they can get such consensual agreement amongst their friends and their subculture that like everything in the national media is manipulated and it's lies. And they don't realize that most of the information in the mass media is actually usually far more accurate than the urban legends and the stuff that Alex Jones or somebody like that is saying. And you can find this because their predictions don't come true. You know, if you actually start taking notes and see the things that some of them say are about to happen, like FEMA camps and Amero and so forth, and find out who's better at predicting real-world events, the mainstream news or the conspiracy website, and start keeping score that way, you know, it can be a very shocking revelation.
Well,
and
I
like
to counter that, I think a lot of people are just
sure.
Some things take decades to unfold. A lot of these.
I'm sorry, you're breaking up. Unfortunately,
yeah.
I didn't hear what you said.
No, can you hear me right now?
Yeah.
Yeah, now you're good.
No, I mean a lot of these things may take decades to play out, and as far as World War II goes, I mean, if what they say, the conspiracy theorist, is correct, and these central bankers are funding both sides of every war, then perhaps that war we were meant to play the part of the good guys. I suspect, I'm not going to say for certain, of course, but that maybe they wanted to use America in the future, in a sense, to, you know, be the beacon of light for the world, to police the world, to advance their agenda, as the conspiracy theorists say, for, you know, the one world government, because we would be the front man for that.
Well, basically what you have, I mean, and Terence McKenna, by the way, had the same point of view in this as I do. He called many of these theories epistemological cartoons. Is basically you have a group of human egos that's so clever that they can manipulate world events. And like Terence described it as like trying to control a dream. There are so many uncontrolled variables going on this planet that the idea that any one group is capable, if they were that good, they probably should run the world. But nobody is that clever.
I don't believe
to be able
that. I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I mean, I just don't buy it. I mean, I think the evidence that you have a bunch of tribes competing with each other is far more convincing than the idea that there's one set of puppet masters behind the whole thing.
What about,
unless it's a different species.
What about, well, yeah, I don't want to rule that out, but what about a bunch of tribes working together? Like maybe not like necessarily, you know, one particular group, the Illuminati that it runs the entire world, but what about, you know, dozens of separate groups that work together?
But have similar agendas.
With similar agendas.
Yeah. Kind of like what you said with Google and Apple. You know, they might compete, but really they get behind the doors and they fix their prices with each other.
Well, I mean, there certainly, you know, are cartels and things like that, but I mean, Google and Apple aren't fixing prices together. I mean, they're
I'm talking. Let's say Bilderberg Group, Bohemian Group, Skull and Bone, you know, et cetera. Like
international banking cartel.
Trilateral Commission,
banking cartels.
Well,
I mean, like,
Council of Rome.
Well, one of the reasons why I think that they may seem like they're more connected in some cases than they are, and I'm not saying that there aren't conspiracies. Obviously there are, and there are nefarious groups and so forth. But one of the reasons why they may seem to be more like one tribe as compared to many groups competing with each other often is that they're all psychopaths, or it's a culture of psychopathy. And this is a subject I write about too. Is it's only 1% of the population, but psychopaths are great at finding their way to pinnacles of power, whether it's in the church or it's in corporations. The professional group that tests out the highest in psychopathy are CEOs. So because, and according to some evolutionary biologists, psychopaths are best understood as a valid subspecies. There are genetic markers for it, and there are reasons why they're a very successful adaptation. And so because psychopaths operate in such similar ways, you can start to have fantasies that there's some race of reptilians or something like that. See, a lot of these things make perfect sense if you take a half metaphorical step away from them. So if you start, instead of saying that there are shape-shifting reptilians and that the Bush family are, dining on live fetuses for breakfast, and say that there are people who are controlled by the reptile part of the brain, then that starts to make a whole lot of sense. And so the idea that we're being manipulated and that there are groups that are like it may make sense on a different level than what many conspiratists are saying literally. And in fact, maybe the group that's behind all it is a different species that's manipulating us to keep fighting with each other and to think that different other tribes are the ones that are because I've never had somebody come forward and say like, oh yeah, and I'm one of the conspiracy people. Like whenever you hear people casting shadow and talking about they never include themselves. They're always the innocent ones, and it's over there, they're the bad ones. And it's like, I don't know if you ever saw the Richard Linklater movie Dazed and Confused. They're like smoking some weed and stuff on like their last night at school or something, and they're like, maybe we're the aliens.
Right.
You see? What is everybody doing out there that we think are the bad guys, but doing the very same thing we are? They're pointing the finger at somebody else. And so it's kind of like in Lord of the Rings, where Sauron is using his black magic in the background, and he's getting like the whole council of the ring. The dwarves are fighting with the elves, and they're fighting with each other. But actually, it is a dark necromancer that they can't see who's manipulating all of them like a mind parasite to get them to fight with each other.
Sure. No, I know that it makes sense. I guess I wonder why it couldn't be brought to a bigger level.
Yeah, I mean it would only make sense that things would be true on multiple levels, because that's the idea of like a holon. Like we live in a holographic universe. Like that's why the alchemist said, as above, so below. Just like we find all these kind of things going on in the microbiological world, where organisms are manipulating other organisms, it's happening at every level. And we just have to be very careful when we think we know the level on which it's happening and we know specifically who the bad guys are, and if only we could just get rid of all the central bankers, then evil would go away, except that it wouldn't, because it has an independent origination within each of us. And then there'll be the new set of bankers, or the new whatever it is, or maybe we'll just live in a road warrior world, and instead of worrying about central bankers who might seem pretty tame, it'll be the biker gang that's coming down the road and wants to rape your girlfriend. So it's whenever you start thinking that there's a particular, it's like Nietzsche said, be careful in battling monsters that you don't yourself become a monster. He also said when you gaze into an abyss, it starts to gaze back at you. So whenever we're in that, like, when we start to fall too familiarly and too often into that like fear mode and like look at what they are doing, the bankers, the whoever's, then I sort of see the hand of Mordor reaching into those people, whichever side they're on, and keeping us in the forever war that allows us to our energy to be harvested, the darker energies to be harvested, and that'll just keep going on forever, unless we start to wake up.
And manifest from talking about dark energies.
Oh yeah.
Of course. I mean, how could it be otherwise? But I'm not saying that we shouldn't be. I'm all for like pointing out dark things, but where that's
good
especially
to be aware
helpful.
Of the dark energy.
Yes, but the work that almost nobody wants to do, and whether you're a fundamentalist, religionist, or a New Age person, the work that almost nobody wants to do is the shadow work of looking at your own shadow and your own darkness. It's much more comfortable to get together with a bunch of your buddies and talk about like, oh, they're the ones and so forth. Whoever your buddies are. If you're evangelicals, if you're Muslims, if you're conspiratists, you can very comfortably get together with your friends and talk about they.
The shadows of the world.
And that's a big relief because you never have to talk about me or I and like the slightly creepy little things that we do when we're not even only half looking ourselves.
I'm glad you're saying all this because my aunt is hugely into what you're saying, and she's been saying this all my life, as far as what you focus on is what you get. You kind of manifest it into reality. So if you focus on the negative, it eventually comes to pass. And I agree as far as like the opening song. I think it needs to be toned down. It is I see that Megatron sounding.
You're breaking up pretty bad.
Did you hear anything I just said?
No, not really.
Yeah, I heard you breaking up too, so I missed most of that.
Oh,
but
man.
I heard some of the stuff about your aunt and something about an opening song. So.
Yeah. Can you hear me right now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. She always mentioned that you attract what you focus on. So if you're focusing and you're worried about something happening, then it's going to eventually happen, sometimes instantly. And yeah, that opening song, I could definitely see that attracting some negative energies.
I think there's a great truth in that principle where I disagree with some people and what they do with it, like New Age people who are fundamentalists with the absolutism, you create your own reality, which I've criticized, is they take a key reality formation vector or force and they make it into an invincible principle. Because I could be a Jew in Warsaw, Poland, and start having very pleasant, peaceful thoughts about Nazis, but that doesn't mean that the Nazis are going to treat me gently.
Yeah.
But if I go to a party thinking like, yeah, everybody hates me, and so forth, that's very likely to affect the experience I'm going to have there, because now I'm having those thoughts in a social network that's of a scale and in a dynamic system where what's going on in my psyche is likely to have a much more powerful effect. Whereas, like, if I live near an earthquake zone and my plan is to never think about earthquakes and that will prevent earthquakes, that may not work, because what's happening geologically is on a different scale and is not the right kind of dynamic system for my psyche, individually to affect. But if I'm hanging out with 5 people at a party, that's a scale on which those effects will be far more powerful. So I have my own philosophy I call dynamic paradoxicalism, where you need to recognize that like every truth is a paradox, that the opposite of a profound truth is another profound truth. So on the opposite of you create your own reality is outside reality creates you. And sometimes it's more the one factor, sometimes it's more the other factor. And so there's kind of a sliding or dynamic relationship between them. So sometimes I might be, acting like a jerk, and so other people are treating me based on that. But I could also be like a citizen of Pompeii, and the volcanic magma is rushing toward the town, and that's outside reality, and it's going to affect everybody equally, regardless of how positive or negative they are, or whatever.
Very cool.
Yeah, definitely.
So, so I have to ask then. I mean, it kind of sounds gloomy. Is there I ask this a lot of times, and it sounds kind of like cliched, but is there any hope? It kind of sounds like we're kind of bound to this darkness in which we cannot escape. What can we do about these evil forces in the world? Can we actually do anything?
I'm actually a tremendous optimist, and my most important work is about something I call the singularity archetype, which is, I believe, like an underlying pattern that bubbles up out of the collective unconscious through people's dreams, visions, through science fiction, through religious ideology sometimes, that's showing us a basic pattern of metamorphosis that plays out when people have near-death experiences, when people die, but also shows us the potential evolutionary event horizon for the species. And it actually takes darkness and it takes struggle, just like it took parasites to create sexual differentiation, according to the Red Queen hypothesis. From a sufficiently large evolutionary context, the adversarial forces will turn out to be key developmental catalysts. And we, I believe, are hurtling toward, though I have no idea how long it will take, toward a transformational evolutionary event horizon, where all the things that seem dark and terrible may turn out to be the very things that were necessary to spur evolution. Because all organisms are conservative. They dial in a certain equilibrium, biologists call it homeostasis, and they don't change that unless there's a huge threat. So it might be perfect to trigger an evolutionary metamorphosis to have a huge sword of Damocles hang over our head. Maybe we won't be ready for this quantum evolutionary shift until the whole genome, until the whole species is threatened. And so that's why, from the singularity archetype material, what to the ego seems like apocalypse can, from a more cosmic vantage, be revealed to be a quantum evolutionary event, but that looks very dark if you're from the street point of view, if that makes any sense.
Oh, it makes perfect sense. Very cool.
It really does, yeah.
Yeah.
I've always wondered that, too, if, like hardships are character builders, like these tough times have kind of transformed us positively to some degree.
Yeah, exactly. Like I wrote a little essay called Tolkien and the Developmental Need for Evil. Like, let's say Lord of the Rings is basically a story about a huge evolutionary shift. One world is going to end and another is going to develop if the Fellowship of the Ring can succeed with their quest to, cast Precious into the cracks of doom. And basically, but imagine if we took ring wraiths, Sauron, Saruman, and orcs and so forth out of Lord of the Rings. You'd have a world where, like, hobbits would be going out with dates with other hobbits. Like it would be a very stagnant world where nothing would be happening. You wouldn't have transformation. You wouldn't have an interesting story. So what makes an interesting story is the same thing that makes an interesting and developmental life. And for you to have, be like if I said, write a story about somebody your age who's going to have an amazing transformational life. If you gave them the perfect job, the perfect girlfriend, the perfect economy, and, governments that were doing what governments are supposed to do and that didn't have conspiracies, you'd have a boring life. You wouldn't have a story, and you wouldn't have an interesting person at the end of that process. So we need some amount of struggle and some amount of adversity for there to be development. Unfortunately, it doesn't mean that in every case that works out perfectly, because some people, in an individual case, there are people who are just crushed by hardship and crushed by dark forces. It's something that, but there are other people who, emerge from life-threatening illnesses and suicide attempts to, have amazing transformation. So it doesn't work out in every individual case, but it may work out for the species.
Well said, okay.
Have you ever heard that saying, diamond. It's a diamond is just a piece of charcoal that handled stress well. You've heard of that, right?
Right, yeah. I mean, I was actually going to bring that up, that, it's millennia of, temperature and pressure makes a diamond,
no different.
Yeah, I mean... Yeah, you want to talk about dark things happening to the planet. Here's something that blows away anything that any Illuminati or any conspiracy has ever done. The asteroid that apparently hit the Earth 65 million years ago, that was so devastating it basically flattened anything larger than a chicken, as my friend Terence McKenna put it, and wiped out the dinosaurs and created like nuclear winter. And it was absolutely devastating, and it would be like a million hydrogen bombs going off at once or something like that. But
do you
that was
think
the opportunity
extinction
for
is
men
part
and
of
animals.
evolution?
Sorry?
Do you think extinction is part of evolution?
Sure. I mean, if you don't have, it's just like if dumb phones don't go extinct, then we don't get smartphones. You have to have some forms die off to create new forms, and so that's true technologically and it's true biologically, and but I think it's the threat of extinction that is most likely to allow evolutionary transformation.
Okay.
I mean, all species have a limited lifespan. The average is 100,000 years for mammalian species. It's 1 million years, but that's still a very small amount of time.